What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Thought Experiment. Today's episode, we're going to be focusing on Precision Neuroscience, another company that builds these electrode arrays that are used, in Precision's case, mainly for monitoring during tumor resections or tumor removals, or for localizing epilepsy onset locations in patients. Precision Neuroscience uses what's called the Layer 7 cortical interface implant. And it is a micro electrocorticography array, or micro ECOG array. And what that means is that it is actually going to be sitting on the pia mater of the brain. And it is a flat electrode that does not penetrate into the brain. Instead, what it does is it basically sits on top of the brain and utilizes the fact that the brain has this columnar organization, typically, in which similar neurons, or neurons that are going to be active during similar things, say moving an arm in a certain direction, or the typical thought for columnar is in the visual processing, in which you have columns that are organized to fire to specific directions of objects in your visual field or contrasts in your visual field. But this similar style of organization in the brain happens across multiple layers or multiple areas. And so the micro ECOG array, this layer 7 cortical interface device that Precision uses, is again this hexagonal grid that is placed on top of the skull and does not directly penetrate. And it's 5 microns thick polyimide film, which is a biocompatible film. And it has 1,024 up to 1,024 platinum electrodes in this hexagonal grid. So it's got a lot of electrodes spaced at about 400 microns, again, trying to utilize this columnar organization of the brain to achieve very high spatial resolution in a horizontal manner across the brain. Again, not a vertical manner, in a vertical manner, but trying to have a broad swath of cortex in which they can record from neurons that are implicated in many different things. Their electrode achieves about 750 times higher in electrodes per square centimeter, or electrode density, than the typical ECOG arrays. And again, this is because it's this micro ECOG array, where they have much smaller spacing on a much larger array. So they can fit a lot of more contacts onto their array. One of the large innovations for Precision Neuroscience is the actual deployment mechanism for implanting the electrodes. The electrodes are implanted through this cranial microslit, where the surgeons, instead of having to perform a full craniectomy, which is typical for ECOG array placement, again for epilepsy or for tumor resection, and I'll get to why it's important for both of those techniques to be monitoring during surgery or to be monitoring long term. A patented procedure that Precision uses implements a less than 1 millimeter slit or incision into the skull, where neurosurgeons then use endoscopic guidance, so very small cameras or radio guidance, to deploy this 1024 channel electrode array. And it takes only about 60 seconds. So again, you're lowering the time of surgical implantation and the degree of surgical implantation the degree of the brain that needs to be exposed to surgical implantation. And the reason that's important is that when surgeons go in there and they have to remove not only the skull, but they also need to remove the dura. So you can think about it this way, right? So we have the skin. I'll explain a little bit about the actual organization from the brain itself up to our scalp. So we have at the top, we have our scalp. Underneath that, which is our skin, underneath that, we have our skull. Underneath the skull, we have what's called the dura. And what the dura is, it is basically the protection layer of the brain against all of the brain and the central nervous system against all outside entities. This is where the blood-brain barrier exists, where we have very high filtration systems, so that we have very minimal unnecessary things crossing into the brain, because of how vital the central nervous system is to us living. And so through this micro incision, they also then make a incision into the dura. And through the incision into the dura, and this is where you expose then the pia mater And so you have pia and you have arachnoid. And the pia is basically what connects to the dura and allows for the brain to kind of shake and move around, while the arachnoid kind of keeps everything tightly bound together. And so you're going to be placing this array on top of the pia mater underneath the dura. And the benefit then of not having to open or do a full craniotomy, is that you then expose less of the brain to any outside sources of disease, which can be very dangerous. Diseases of the brain can move very rapidly and can cause long-term effects, if not death, very quickly. And treatments for those diseases tend to be very, very expensive, like antibiotic type treatments if you get an infection of the brain. Encephalitis or something like that, or the central nervous system, can be very difficult to treat. So when possible, you try not to puncture the dura, but for the highest fidelity recordings, because the dura acts as this kind of sheath, you actually do want to go underneath the dura, but you're not directly penetrating the brain, right? So you're going to actually have less of an immunoresponse to that area, making your signal quality possibly better, though not as fine resolution as you would be if you penetrated into the brain, which is a different aspect of a safety mechanism for this type of device. But again, I'll get back on topic a little bit. So it's level 7 cortical interface device. It is used to record local field potentials and some multi-unit activity because of how close it is to the cortex. And it can also deliver focal cortical stimulation. And because it has so many electrodes, it actually has very precise stimulation tuning and control. And the typical use case for this device is recording at those local field potential levels and not necessarily going directly to the multi-unit. And so definitely the stimulation and the local field potentials are the most utilized portions of this device. So then why this device? Why not something else? What is the actual use case for it? So the use case for this layer 7 cortical interface, again, like I talked about, is right now it is approved for use in the acute phase up to 30 days post implant. So typically what this device is used for is when a surgeon goes and they've localized where a tumor is, or they've localized where epileptic seizures are originating from. And so what epilepsy is on a general level is a typically a single source in the brain begins to basically have this continuous synchronized cycle of firing, and that kind of expands outward to the whole brain. And so it ends up being a whole brain synchronization of activity, which causes and induces seizures. And so a grand mal seizure is when the whole brain becomes implicated in this wave of activity. And so once you can localize, so you can utilize this device partially to localize where those seizures are occurring, but you can also then use this device when then the surgeon is going in to resect or to cauterize that area. And so what that means is they're going to remove that area of brain tissue in which the seizures are occurring. And again, you can think of it in the same way as tumor. Once they've localized where a tumor is, the surgeon will go in and it will basically burn out and scoop out this piece of tissue, because our brains, especially in the gray matter, you can remove a large amount as long as it's not eloquent cortex or the fine control of our fingers. Then you can actually remove those cortical layers and still regain the vast majority, if not all, of the functionality that came along with what that piece of cortex was doing. That goes to how interconnected and widespread activity and association with different instances of movement or of speech or of hearing or perception and thinking are in the brain. And so typically the surgeons, when they're either removing this tumor or this piece of brain that is largely implicated in the seizures, what they'll do is they'll put these devices on the patients. And in order to ensure that they're not damaging any necessary brain tissue for specific function, they will both stimulate and record from the brain in order to avoid damaging any very necessary portions of brain tissue that the individual or the patient would be left with chronic issues if damaged. One of the benefits of this device, like I mentioned a little earlier, is it's not that it's not invasive, but it's minimally invasive, where they have this small opening, again leading to less possibility of disease, but also a lesser of an inflammatory response because they're not directly penetrating the brain. So they are kind of in a middle ground between non-invasive and fully invasive devices. For paradromics, previously we've talked about how their electrodes actually go directly into the skull or into the brain and are fully invasive because they penetrate into the brain. Surgical use and not in the chronic use phase that previous devices have been looking for FDA clearance and approval on for motor control or prosthetic control in functional rehabilitation. Precision kind of tackled this problem more from let's begin in the acute phase. Let's begin in the non-chronic use cases where we can gather a lot of fully develop our methods of analysis without having to directly go through the full FDA pipeline for chronic implantation. The reason being that ECOG arrays have been used for resections and epilepsy monitoring for decades at this point. And so it's a little bit easier to get a new device into that market than to get one into market for prosthetic control, cursor control, and motor rehabilitation studies. So where does that put Precision's regulatory roadmap and some of their patenting? In 2023, Precision Neuroscience got breakthrough device designation, which expedites the review pathway for the clinical application of the device in paralysis, speech decoding, and speech disorders. And so that was fast tracking, again, still a long-term, very expensive process of getting this for chronic use. But the big thing is that they have got a 510K clearance in April of 2025. And what that means, again, this 510K usage is basically piggybacking off of the use of ECOG arrays for a very long time. And what this is for is that 30-day period where they previously had clearance for hourly or during surgical use only or prior to surgical use. But now they get to implant and record for up to 30 days for doing this high-resolution brain mapping for surgery, for epilepsy localization. Again, intraoperative brain mapping, tumor removal guidance, and currently they have implanted 37 patients as of April 2025. And so they're the first wireless BCI company to actually achieve that full FDA clearance on that 510K. But again, it's still acute. It's still non-chronic because it's only for 30 days. And it's for distinct brain mapping and tumor removal guidance purposes. So this is an advantage they have over competitors, but again, they're still kind of in that same boat for the breakthrough device authorization to actually get chronic use for paralysis and speech disorders. They basically currently have studies going on at a few different locations where they have their pilot and feasibility study that they finished up, and they're continuing these neural mapping and BCI algorithm development studies, but mainly for the mapping as of March 2024, and they're continuing to go through those studies, probably being done either sometime this year or next year. And again, they haven't yet launched a formal phase 2 or 3 clinical pivotal trial for BCI functional restoration, again for speech or paralysis, and that is because their current focus is mainly again on that safety validation. And now that they have the 510K clearance to collect up to 30 days, that's going to give them a lot of data on a lot of patients that come in needing this either tumor resection or epilepsy mapping, in which they're going to be able to collect a lot of data to train their models for the eventual use case of doing speech decoding. Part of the issue, though, is they don't necessarily have in humans much data to talk about the chronic use, and so it's going to be difficult to make the argument for its chronic use case since they don't have well-characterized data for 30 plus days in the precision implants, which is a little different than some of the other companies which have started to gather more and more data in actual humans in the chronic term, like paradromics, like a Neuralink. Though it's not to take away from the fact, again, that they're the first wireless BCI with full FDA clearance on that 510K clearance for surgical use. They have the highest, it's seemingly, electrode density count at 1,024. And they actually, because they have this 510(k) clearance, and because this is a previously charted expense and coded expense for insurance companies, they're actually going to be able to generate revenue from the brain mapping procedures. And so that's going to be a big up for them in terms of their competitors, because they're not necessarily going to purely need to rely on their data collection to come from funding sources to then conduct these FDA trials, but instead they can conduct studies and gather data while they're being paid in gathering revenue for their product. Though again, no published BCI functional restoration data yet. The big question though is how large actually is this brain mapping market? How much of it could this new device kind of take out, and what chunk can Precision take in that market? And is this something where they're going to really need to look to expand? Because as I get more experience and listen to more people, the money in these systems is tough. The upfront costs of building and developing the systems are high, and there is not right now a fully fleshed out way of saying here is going to be the payback of these devices. And so where do they currently sit in the market? Where might there be open market opportunities for them to infiltrate as they continue to go through the FDA process? Where should they look as the greatest area of returns to then expand this to the most affected individuals? The tough things with these industries, with health industries, is that the best treatments for the most impaired individuals are going to be very expensive, and the addressable market is going to be low. And so the ability to generate revenue to actually then continue the research into that technology and to make it pay for itself is much less. And so what's typically done is you try to expand and you try to find a wide ranging market in which you can apply something to a lot of people, get funding to get through the FDA. And then if you can get through FDA with a device that is meant for a larger market cause, then what you can do is you can then piggyback that device to then go and utilize it for the most affected and impaired individuals. So say you create some technology that records from the brain, aids in depression, or aids in rehabilitation from stroke, areas of larger impact, because there's more and more people that are diagnosed with it. A lot of people have it. And so the market, the size of the people that you can actually give this device to and this treatment to is larger. Then what you can do is you can take that technology, and now that if you've gotten it through FDA clearance and you've gotten it FDA approved, you can then go back to the FDA and say, hey, look, we've got this approved device. It's been shown to work in people with this condition, and it's been shown to be safe. Can we now go and study it and use it for this other scenario? It makes the process significantly easier, and provides the same benefit to that more or less voluminous or populated group of people by first marketing and targeting a larger market group. So for Precision, currently, the company's trying to grab a piece of typically an only like $1 billion a year industry, anticipated to get to around 1.5 billion by 2033. And again, it's tough because it's intraoperative brain mapping, and so it's not as large as building devices for possible use cases and much larger caseloads and much larger patient populations. Though they have done recent partnership deals, like I've mentioned before, with Medtronic, which is a massive player in the biotechnology, biomedical engineering field, and they've been around for a while. And so it's very promising for them that they have this now connection and this partnership with Medtronic for possibly moving forward in, gathering a greater set of physicians and surgeons that Medtronic likely has contact with to utilize their device to build out their possible addressable market. Again, good for them. They have reimbursement codes already for these intraoperative monitoring. And so typically, for a complex neurosurgical case of about 60 to 90 minutes, the cost ranges from $130 to $300, and total institutional cost per complex procedure like this goes between $2 to $5 grand when accounting for the technology, the personnel, and the overhead. And across about 34,500 annual malignant brain tumor resections in the US, plus some additional spinal cord and neurosurgical procedures that require neuromonitoring. The annual market likely would exceed around 3.25 to 4.84 billion globally. So again, that's not massive. That's not these hundreds of billion-dollar industries where these devices really end up paying for themselves and for the future of the technology. Now, what if they can pivot? What if they can pivot and begin to be fast-tracked even more through that FDA process towards the non-just surgical use, the implantation for rehabilitation, for paralysis, for speech decoding? There's about 18,000 new cases annually for that. For spinal cord injury, or for ALS, it's about 30,000, 33,000 annually, or total cases with around 5 to 6,000 new ones annually. Stroke would be a massive market, because there's about 750,000 people a year in the U.S. that suffer a stroke, and about 40% will have chronic motor deficits. Traumatic brain injury, Flach-Dinh syndrome, that can create a much larger field of about 5.5 million with functional impairment, with about 1 million-ish candidates for possible implantables because of the severity of those impairments. And so that then puts you closer to more multi-billion-dollar industry, which can be a little bit more appealing to investors and to people to give you money to develop and to expand the use and manufacturing of these devices. Now, if you follow Neuralink, they are very bullish in the amount of surgeries that they predict that they will be doing for their devices. I don't see where those numbers really come from of doing 2 to 10 to 20,000 by 2031 surgeries a year. I just don't know if there's that many people willing to undergo that invasive a surgery in which you don't fully understand the chronic implications, whether this thing will work in 5 to 10 years, right? If you're 61 and you're going to get something implanted and then in a year and a half it's not going to work, are you going to be happy with that? You really want something that's going to be at least a decade, even more. And so this is a difficult portion of this work in this space, is that currently the market just doesn't seem there yet, because the technology, while incredible, there's too many ifs about how it will work, how long it will work, to really know if this is something that's going to explode, that can explode. There is definitely more investment recently in the U.S. and China has dedicated a large amount of money. So China, yeah, they put out an implementation plan for promoting innovation, development of the BCI industry straight from the top down under their 15th five-year plan, and they're looking at very, very large investments from the regional, provincial, I believe, governments in China, and they're pushing. They're looking to push, and so it's definitely going to be interesting. I'm going to do a full podcast, I think, breakdown of the difference in the brain-computer interface market in China, how they're pushing it, how they're trying to push it forward, and develop out their research in universities and in private companies. Similarly, how they did it with electric vehicles versus the U.S., in which the industry is definitely gaining private capital, in which a lot of these things comes from, while both the institutional grade research, right, is very, very important, but the commercial grade applications and the clinical grade applications typically come through private funding to development. But continuing on for the episode, the market size, similar to these other companies, they're really going to want to try to expand purely from a paralysis or a or restoration or a cursor control point of view for very, very impaired individuals, to the stroke market, and then possibly again to this mental illness, depression, bipolar depression, severe depression, major depressive disorder, where you have a greater patient population. And then you can come back, you can say that you've applied this device and given help to a larger patient population. But now, because this device is approved and applicable in this patient population, let's take it to the smaller ones that need it the most. Or not necessarily the most, because I don't want to put gradings on these things, but that have greater either functional deficits or cognitive deficits that require this broader range of help. that their devices can do. It's just they needed to push it towards a larger patient population first. Now, like we tend to do, let's look a little bit at the leadership, the financial health of precision neuroscience. They've actually got a pretty strong team from previous experience and exits and amounts of money raised. It's pretty incredible, the group that they have there. I'll start with Benjamin Rappaport, their MD, PhD, Chief Science Officer and co-founder, where again, Dr. Rappaport is a practicing neurosurgeon at Mount Sinai, and he got his PhD in electrical engineering. So pretty big time, and prior exit experience he had with a company called Symbionics, which was acquired by Apple in 2014. And he has then experience, with working in this acquisition phase, and with discussions of fundraising and actually building a company that goes to market, whether that again is through acquisition or possibly future public offering. And he was one of the founding members at Neuralink. He has now since left to develop precision neuroscience, but he has about 20 years plus of experience developing this type of technology with many publications, and again, very strong actually academic and again that surgical experience as well. Now let's move on to the CEO, Michael Mager, I don't really know, and co-founder, where he spent a lot of time in private equity world and venture capital. So he's very much so a leader, very much so has a lot of leadership experience, a lot of financial experience and economics experience. He previously does also have that venture experience where he co-founded Assembly Software, a legal technology company, and they haven't exited that one, but he's built a previous base in both private equity and in venture capital. He knows how the economics of these industries work. He knows how fundraising works, and he knows how a lot of these operations work. So then we move on to the president, chief product officer, Craig Mermel, who's also an MD PhD. He's got a PhD in genetics, and he is a practicing physician. Again, began his career at Apple, and then went to Google, and he was part of the Symbiotics team with the chief science officer, Benjamin Rappaport. And so they left Symbiotics and exited Symbiotics together following its acquisition, and Mermel stayed on at Apple for a little while, and then started and co-founded in 2021 Precision Neuroscience with Rappaport. He has leadership through major tech companies as well as previous founding experience and exit experience, and so he's bringing strong industry and medical world expertise to the president and chief product officer role. Again, big heavy hitter here, John Wook, who's a PhD. He is the chief business officer, and is very much so a biomedical device expert. He was the executive vice president and chief marketing and strategy officer at Exonics, which was acquired by Boston Scientific for $3.7 billion in 2024. One of the major biomedical engineering acquisitions, think of all time. He has a lot of success in neuromodulation and medical device development, given that time at Exonics, where he played, again, an integral role in the design of the product and the clinical trial oversights in both Europe and the United States, which in this world, in the biomedical engineering, the biotechnology world, clinical trial FDA experience is huge. They already have experience in operations from the Symbiotics members and in exiting from the Symbiotics members and in medical practice. Now we get a very strong FDA clinical experience or FDA experience and previous biotechnology company experience from their chief business officer. That then coupled together with their CEO, who has the more financial aptitude and venture capital kind of money making and moving aptitude. His team is shaping out very strong. Then we move to the senior vice president of R&D, is Vanessa Tolosa, who was also a founding member at Neuralink, and served as the director of their neural interfaces. They are a PhD, and they've strong background in the development of these types of devices, in building high bandwidth neural recording suites. She worked at a national lab and has been long time thought as a foundational thought leader in the field of advanced neurotechnologies. I think it brings to the table that previous founder experience and a lot of strong product development and research experience, which is huge for this R&D role. And as Precision looks to not only continue to build out the best possible device for surgical mapping use, but also for then chronic use later on. Then lastly, from what I will mention, is the Director of Medical Affairs. This one is huge, as it's Vivek Pinto, who's a PhD, MBA, but brings 12 years of tenure at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. This is massive for a company like Precision, for any biotechnology company, especially to have with you on a daily basis, not even just as a consultant, but having a hired employee, a director of your medical affairs that has direct long-term experience with the FDA is going to be massive in knowing how to phrase, knowing how to approach the FDA, and knowing kind of the ins and outs of that regulatory game, because it's something they have to play. It's a game you have to play, and the ones that play it best are the ones that are going to end up making it out. You could have the best device in the world, the best technology in the world. If you can't go to the FDA with the proper study design, with the proper diagnostic tests, knowing the groups that you need to speak to directly, you're not gonna make it through. So that is very, very massive. And again, this is just a heavy hitter lineup of industry experience, FDA experience, economics experience, fundraising experience, and strong technical and medical experience. It's a very great group. If there was a poly market or a Cauchy market on who will be the largest winner, it's tough, again, always to bet against Elon Musk because of things just happen. But Precision would be a not betting advice, but Precision would be somebody you would want to keep a strong eye on as to a possible winner in the future. Purely not just because of their device's incredible nature and ability, but also because of their very highly skilled, highly technical staff and leadership. Over time, they've raised, from their first round to their most recent round in 2021 was their first $12 million, 2023, $41 million, 2024, $27.5 million, and then 2024, again, $102 million for a total of $182.65 million. They are raising money, which is awesome. Their newest round in capital raise was led by General Equity Holdings, and they've also had experience with Stanley F. Druckenmiller's Kane Family Office and Steadview Capital, some players of the venture capital world. Their valuation after this round was brought to nearly $542.69 million. Not every company discloses their valuations, but this is around 15x increase from their Series A, which was at about $36 million in 2021. There's a lot of confidence. There is a lot of belief in this company when it comes to their investors. Similar to how we've done with the other companies, let's look at some of their burn rate. They have about 70 plus employees as of December 2024, where their typical salary or typical spend on employees per employee per month is about 20 grand. So you have 70 employees, 20 grand a month per employee. That's going to bring you to about $1.4 million per month. This is not incorporating any FDA regulatory procedure costs or anything like that, development costs. And again, companies like this, like I've talked about before, they typically exceed $2 to $3 million a month in costs because of how much money it takes for development and for FDA study continuation. And so I think around $2 to $2.5 million a month is a reasonable range for how much burn. If that $2 million a month is the case, and we estimate them at between $130 to $150 million in cash, that puts them at about 50 weeks of runway, which is, over 4 years. And to think that they wouldn't have more breakthroughs, more capital raised by them is silly. And so I do anticipate that they're in a very strong financial position. I think that they're in a very strong financial position. They have very high investor confidence. Their science and their results, especially in their 30-day use, will be very interesting to see. Their partnerships with an industry kind of grandfather, an industry leader of Medtronic in the biotech world is very good news. This is definitely a very bullish company to look at and to continue to follow over the next 5, 10, 15 years, if not for an acquisition by a larger company, let alone a future public offering and continued development in the field. Where they could run into issues is if they have any regulatory mishaps, but again, given their leadership, I don't really see that happening in their FDA experience in their leadership, any patient recruitment challenges, or if somebody else becomes a major player, somebody else starts garnering the funding, it could get more and more difficult. If the field continues to expand and money becomes thinner and thinner, in which you have more players putting money into more places, but not necessarily increasing the volume of money that they're giving out, that could be an issue. But again, I'm very bullish on precision. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see whether or not they actually continue to get positive results, especially for chronic use. But if I were putting money into a company at a good valuation, this is definitely a company that I think is going to make returns on their investments. But again, not investment advice. Where else might their risk lie? Their risk could lie in the practical use for a device like this in doing more very high throughput use cases, very high bit rate use cases, where again, they're not necessarily getting the same precision that you would get in a more invasive implant in which you actually penetrate the brain tissue and get much finer single unit, multi-unit resolution. But again, they're utilizing this columnar organization of the cortex, and they have such high spatial density that it's tough to fully make that argument, though you're not going to necessarily get the full degrees of freedom that you could get with the fully invasive technology. But you get the benefits of not having as large an immune response, though the current literature on the chronic immune response to epidural or subdural arrays is not as high as it should be when going into and making conclusions about the long-term efficacy and use cases for these technologies. Again, they still don't have a clear path, though they've gotten the breakthrough device clearance. They haven't started to a chronic use case trial yet, and again, that takes a little while. And so currently they are behind the 8 ball to others that have begun implants in patients for clinical trials and chronic use and motor restoration and rehabilitation. So they're definitely behind the 8 ball a little bit there. And so it'll be interesting to see how they compare again in 3 to 5 years when they're actually going through those clinical trials for long-term chronic use cases. Overall, I think Precision's in a great spot. I think that they need to definitely focus on generating as much revenue as they can currently from the 30-day use case, FDA 510(k) clearance, while also maintaining a strong focus on getting those clinical trials started, getting through the FDA regulatory pathway as quickly as they can, because again, that can take 3 to 7 years and takes a lot of money to get through, while their competitors are already there, while Synchron is already there, while Neuralink has already begun. It's going to be tough. It's going to be increasingly difficult for them to continue to compete towards the goal of a chronic implant for speech restoration, motor restoration, paralysis, if they can't get those trials started. But I think they're in a great spot. They've got a great leadership team. They've got money right now. They've got a current revenue stream that they can use. And so I'm a very big fan of Precision. It's definitely going to be one that I will continue to follow and give updates on as the time goes. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Thought Experiment on Precision Neuroscience. It's been great making these episodes. It hasn't been as consistent, but it's really kind of when I have time, I'm going to be making them. And so I appreciate everyone listening. I'll say it again, like I've said in every episode, this is my passion. These are the things I love. I think that these devices will be transformational in the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, not only for clinical applications, but for consumer applications, for the way that we communicate and interface with each other and understand each other and interact with the world around us. And so I'm very excited for the continued development, the continued research. Yeah, have a great day. This was the Thought Experiment.